Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, we've been thinking demographically recently. A few days ago, we did a show with the Washington, D.C. based academic, Cynthia Miller Idris. She has a new book out, Man Up, the New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, not just about the difference between men and women these days, but young men and young women, particularly Generation Z. And of course, they are tragically very much in the news. The Wall Street Journal yesterday had an interesting op-ed on Tyler Robinson and America's lost boys from Gen Z. There seems to be a lost quality, perhaps not just to the boys, but the girls of Gen Z. I'm part of the boomer generation, but there is a group of people somewhere caught between the Gen Zers and the boomers. They are Generation X, and that is the subject of our show today, Millennials. What happened to Millennials in defense of a generation, with my guest, Charlie Wells, who is normally based in London, but is in New York today to celebrate the publication of his book. Charlie, have I made a big error? Have I called Gen Xers Millennials? Are they the same thing?
I think you've done a good job in speaking to the fact that actually the lines between these generations can be a little bit blurry. And actually, this is a point I really want to talk about and get to. But the focus of this book is millennials. And these are people who usually, a lot of research institutes say, are born between the years 1981 and 1996. So Gen X just before. But we'll dig into all this, but there is a case that we actually are being way too rigid in how we're defining a lot of these generations. And that's something that I explore in this book. So I'm glad you actually brought that point up.
Well, we don't want to be rigid on this show, Charlie.
No.
So would it be fair to suggest that whatever we call them, millennials, Gen Xers, that they're caught between these two forces and they sometimes feel a little ignored?
I mean, in some ways, right? I think millennials are now the largest generation in America. So there are 72 million millennials, and they actually surpassed baby boomers, which I think I heard you say you are a member of that generation. They surpassed baby boomers in 2019 as the largest in America. And so, you know, it's interesting because we've been talking a lot about Gen Z. You hear a lot about it in the media. You hear it on the political side. You hear it on the cultural side. You hear a lot about baby boomers and even Gen Xers as they kind of approach retirement. I write about personal finance at Bloomberg, and I wrote this big story about, you know, Gen Xers who are hitting retirement and are shocked that suddenly, you know, they're kind of reaching that key age of 65. And for the past, I'd say 5 or so years, this other generation, the largest in America, has kind of been in the background. And I feel like it's time to have a little bit of a reassessment while we're kind of in this background, while we're kind of in this moment of maybe a pause, to kind of take a look at kind of where we came from, where we're coming. And you're showing this graphic of these different generations. And I think I want to focus on this.
That is from
here.
Wikipedia. So
it's good, yeah.
We got the Zoomers, we got the Millennials, So Millennials are Gen Y, they're not Gen X.
Well, you're bringing up a bunch of really good points here. We used to be called Gen Y. And it's funny because a lot of generations, the name kind of comes not at the beginning, but later on over time throughout history. And one of the points that I make in this book that I wrote about millennials is literally that we used to be called Gen Y. There were also points when they called us the Tamagotchi generation, which I kind of love because I love nostalgia. And I also had a lot of Tamagotchis when I was growing up. But they wanted to call us that. We were potentially a name for us as writers and thinkers are kind of thinking about this group of people who were kind of the children of baby boomers. The 9/11 generation, for obvious reasons, because that kind of hit at a moment when we were becoming cognizant. But it's interesting because millennial, the term, if you want to think about kind of how people talk about groups of people, that name actually stuck as we were entering the workforce. So it was later, right? We were Gen Y for a long time. There were literally books called things like What Happened to Gen Y, or what's going on with the world according to Gen Y, I think is the name of one. But it was when we started entering the workforce, when this idea that we were millennials, that was our name, took off. And it kind of gets at this idea that we kind of came of age. The first of us started turning 18 in 1999, so the end of the millennium. And it just speaks to how important that kind of late 90s, early 2000s history, culture, was to kind of the formation of what's now America's largest living generation.
Yeah, so you're turn of the century types.
Yeah.
Sort of reminds me a little bit of that book on the 90s, which
Great
a number of books, but a number of very interesting studies of the 90s. You're also called, and I'm saying you because you've positioned yourself in the millennial generation, you've been called the unluckiest generation. You unlucky, Charlie, because people changed your names because people aren't sure whether you're Gen X, Gen Y, or Millennials? Is that the problem? You've all been overlooked. Are you the people who are continually screaming and shouting and no one's listening to you?
I think it's not the nomenclature that makes us unlucky. And I think any generation can look back and talk about how unlucky they were, right? And I think that one of the things that made us, at least at the moment in time that we were kind of becoming adults, was the recession. Right.
Which really recession?
Yeah, good question. The great one, the one. But there have been a lot, right? And I think again, these hit.
You mean great because it was a lot of fun, or great?
It was horrible. Yeah,
it was horrible. Which one are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about the one after the financial crisis, right? The worst one since the Great Depression. And this hit, and I think this made us unlucky because it was hitting when we were starting, by and large, and we were starting our careers off. And there was this point back in 2009, when the youth unemployment rate was about 20%. So if you were a young person, 1 out of 5 young people couldn't find a job even if they wanted one. And I remember that. I specifically remember how difficult it was. You'd apply to jobs, you wouldn't get one, you blame yourself. And there's research, and I don't have the exact figures on this, of people who graduate, or cohorts that graduate into recessions are often called unlucky generations because or starting your career can set in a recession can set back your earnings for a long time, right? Because you take whatever you can get. You start low, but then it takes so much longer to catch up. So I think that's one element. I think probably the big one where you could say we were unlucky. But then look, like, I want to be fair here.
But can I jump in here? Because I've heard this a lot, and I have to admit I'm not convinced. I grew up in the 70s.
Okay.
Where there was a very deep recession. It lasted a long time, had very severe implications on lots of fronts. I mean, you talk about the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. It was quite great or deep for a year or two, but it doesn't seem to have had that many long-term implications. So I wonder whether there's something about your generation. Hold on, let me finish. Sure. There's something about your generation that takes pride in living through the greatest recession or 9/11. You're looking for disasters, in other words. And it gives you pleasure and confirms your own insecurities of one kind or another.
It could be that, right? And I think we live in a time of a lot of insecurity, a lot of instability. And, things have turned around a lot since that recession, right? And I think that to keep up this narrative that, oh my goodness, we're so scarred by that recession, I think that's not accurate. But I think I want to own the Great Recession challenge. And I think the part of how that shaped us. And I think a lot of what happens with cohorts, or the story that cohorts tell themselves, is there's this period of kind of childhood innocence, or a period when their expectations are set, right? And then they go out into adulthood and have to kind of navigate whether or not those expectations are going to be met. And I think, and let's talk about boomers in a moment, but I think for millennials, what made that recession, I guess, feel greater than maybe it was, or maybe the numbers have panned out over time, is that we grew up in the 90s, right? And that was a point when it seemed like technology on the face of it was inherently good. The internet was making the economy incredibly productive. From the standpoint of countries like the US or Western Europe, it seemed like, capitalism had won, liberal democracy was bringing about the end of history. Yay. Like in 1999, the Berlin Wall had been down for just about a decade. Like, it wasn't that long. And so people who were growing up in that time internalize a lot of those stories, right? Like, we've won. This is so great. The economy just keeps getting better. The stock market keeps getting better. There's this thing called the internet, and businesses are so much better. All you got to do is just kind of sit back and coast your way. And I think the shift out of that for people who were children then, and then were navigating kind of adulthood post 9/11, of course, which that was a shock in and of itself on the geopolitical.
Well, I want to talk about 9/11, but let me even jump in here. I mean, I take your point, of course, about some of the prosperity of the 90s.
Yeah.
But there was a massive dot-com crash in 1999 that brought the entire... I was in Silicon Valley at the time. In fact, I was an entrepreneur, failed entrepreneur like most of us. So again, it sounds to me like, I'm not just accusing you, but there is this narrative that suggests that everything was great and then everything went bad at the turn of the century. And it's a convenient narrative because it simply confirms one's pre-existing pessimism.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to be pessimistic, and I think it can sound smart to be really pessimistic, and it can sound like you're solving a problem. It can kind of get you out of problem solving. And I think one of the points that I want to make with this book and with this project moving forward is like the story of generations changes and should change, right? Because the underlying data changes. And this is all out there on Millennials. And I think why we need to kind of re-examine the story and kind of, you know, not to give a spoiler alert for the book, but kind of where I end up going is that, you know, Millennials now are, I think it's about 31% richer that on average than baby boomers were at the corresponding period in their life. That's out there, right? So millennials on average are richer. But dig into that number and you see that the gap between the richest millennials and the poorest millennials is something like $100,000 wider than it was for baby boomers. And so it's a different story, right? And I think it's totally fair for you to ask, like, oh, are you guys all, you know, messed up by the Great Recession? No, actually, some people are much, much, much better
right
off.
So it really speaks, maybe in that narrative, it suggests that there really isn't a generation. There are two generations within your millennials, those who have succeeded and those who have failed, and less of a middle class. Let me talk about 9/11. I want to come to the book in a minute, what happened to millennials, although we're sort of talking around it in defense of a generation and what you did for the book. But I'm always astonished with this phrase that sometimes I hear, we lived through 9/11. Now, obviously, if you were unlucky enough to be in one of those buildings, you lived through it, although most people died through it. And it was a catastrophe if you happened to be that tiny proportion of Americans who were affected by 9/11. But do you think that this idea of living through 9/11 is, again, a consequence, a sort of a reflection of cultural pessimism or insecurity? Because for most people, it was dramatic and we all got stranded somewhere, but it didn't actually make that much difference to most people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people in this book, so, you know, I read about kind of high level kind of macroeconomics and politics on one side. And then on another side, I went through and I interviewed about 5 different millennials from different parts of the country. And one of the people in this book, her father died in 9/11. He was working in one of the towers and he died. And one of the themes that I talked about with this woman, who's incredible, and it was such an honor to talk to her, and not just about, you know, 9/11, but what happens after a tragedy like that? How do you go on and live a life after that? But something that she made, a point that she made to me, which gets to your point, is like, I do think that Americans did witness 9/11. I do think it was traumatic, and I think you could see it as something of a collective trauma for people. But it's different than the actual direct victims who lived through it or who had people who were victims in their families, right? Because that has really had heavy implications for people. And I think to kind of conflate the two things is unfair. But I do think that it created a huge shift, right? It created I think for people who were, you're 10 years old, you're in a classroom, you think everything is fine and dandy. You've been told that the United States is ascendant. You've been told that, you know, we are the superpower, the leader of the world. And then suddenly you see a domestic attack for the first time since Pearl Harbor. Like, that's going to shake you, right? Like, that's going to do something to you. And I think sometimes people use that phrase, we lived through 9/11. I think they don't literally mean they were like crawling through the wreckage. But I think what they are saying is they lived through the shock of that, clearly different from what it was like to actually be directly affected by that. But then through the things that happened after, right? Through you know, going through the Bush era, going through the War on Terror, going through this kind of, you know, kind of roller coaster.
What does that mean, going through the Bush era? I
Trusting
mean,
the
everyone
government.
goes through an era.
They did.
Everyone
Yes,
grows up under one president or another. And I'm guessing in 20 years, there's going to be a new rash of books like yours out about this generation that grew up under Trump.
There will be.
Which pales in, which for the Bush, whatever one thinks of the Bush era, it certainly pales in comparison.
Well, I think you're getting at a point that comes up in this really good book about generations by Bobby Duffy, and he's a professor at King's College London. And he basically says that, like, I think the point that I think you're getting to is, like, you can't just sit around and talk about people who were born in between two goalposts on this kind of crazy thing called time that we're all passing through. Like, you can't just kind of look at when someone was born and say, okay, well, this determines who you are, what you are. You have to look at a lot of different stuff too. You have to look at history. And I think the point that you're making is everyone on planet Earth on September 11th, 2001 lived through 9/11, right? And so I think we need to take that into context when we're thinking about a generation. But there's also this issue of life stage. And I really like this one. I think this is something that we need to look at increasingly, is everyone in humanity, since the dawn of it, has kind of gone through a set number of transitions in life. And so if you want to understand something, yes, think about kind of when they're born, what that says about somebody. Think about what they quote unquote went through. And I take your point, like saying like we lived through X, we lived through Y, like that can't be the sole determiner either, right? That's not enough. And I think that's the point you're making. It's not enough just to say, oh, I lived through, the summer
maybe there's another way of thinking of it,
yeah.
Charlie, which I know you covered you've got 5 main characters in this narrative. It's not so much that they lived through 9/11, but it was the first event that was, you talked about the internet earlier, it was the first event that was essentially narrated live online. It was the beginning of blogging. It was the earlier stages of the demise of traditional media, of networks like CNN and Bloomberg, who you work for. So rather than living through 9/11, people began to live through grand historical events, which before that, they were just headlines in a newspaper. Now we all feel intimate with everything that's happened. No doubt there'll be generations talking about, oh, I lived through the assassination of Charlie Kirk, because it got so ubiquitously reported up to the minute on social media. We didn't have social media back in 2001, but we had the beginnings, as I said, of blogging and of the Web 2.0 revolution.
Well, that's something I kind of try to meditate on in this book, and I think is really important. It's kind of how world events affect media and technology, right? And I think that's exactly right. And I think going back to 9/11, that scroll that we see now on cable news every time you turn it on, that kind of is, I think, a behavioral mechanism that keeps people tuned in. That was invented on 9/11, of that kind of scrolling update of news. And then actually after that, you think about how world events shape media. There's the war in Iraq, right? These constant updates, these cable news channels that found they could find audience telling sort of different versions of stories to whatever the audience seemed to want. And I think that, again, was this kind of cable news ecosystem that was developing over the course of, kind of millennials coming to power. And I think, not coming to power, coming to adulthood. And I think something else I talk about in the book is how, we think a lot about social media influencing the millennial generation, Gen Z as well. But there was something that came before, and it was cable news. And I think thinking about how that kind of stream of constant information coming at people, that crawl beneath the screen that came from 9/11, I think that's important.
So your book focuses on 5 different characters who you've picked out as quintessential millennials. Generalizing about them, do they think in generational terms? Are these people who think when they get up in the morning and they think to themselves, who am I? I'm a millennial.
Is this their lead identity? I think it's not their lead identity, but I think it's one that they viewed in a positive light. And I think this is something I really liked. This was a big takeaway, is that we live in a really partisan time. We live in a time when, I think people from different parts of the country, people from different political backgrounds or views, don't talk to each other or have a hard time finding commonalities. but nostalgia, this kind of thinking back to millennial kind of kitsch, as it were, it was unifying. And people, maybe this is the last, one of the last kind of pastures that has not been polarized, but people thinking about, and maybe every generation does this when they're thinking about kind of quote unquote the good old days in childhood. And I think maybe millennials are reaching that point, that life stage where they are looking back and they're having children themselves, right? Some millennials are old enough now that they've got kids in their 20s. Some, have them, are maybe young and they're kind of trying to teach them and they're looking back to their own childhoods. But that was something that just came out time and time again. And I really liked it. And it was really positive to talk about these old brands, these old technologies. AOL Instant Messenger. I think you want to talk about one of the most millennial things you can think of. This is kind of a field where a lot of millennials are kind of discovering who they were. They were having conversations with people that they kind of couldn't have in real life. It was kind of the equivalent of kind of those long phone calls that I think people in other generations had. That was something I loved about this book, talking about the past in a positive way.
As I mentioned, there have been some good books on the 90s. Chuck Klosterman's book I thought was particularly good. It's a cultural history. He talks about the grunge, the darkly ironic quality of 90s cultural life, which is not so much optimistic as ironic. How much did the millennial generation depend on, shall we say, the irony, the distance of the 90s to form itself?
So I think we were just after that. I think that there was this kind of dark, kind of, ironic sense of culture, and, it's bled into, I think, maybe a Gen X kind of identity. I think for millennials, it was a lot more optimistic. It was, there were columns written about at the time about how it was kind of Britney Spears before the downfall, or how it was kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or how it was these kind of squeaky clean, kind of teenage, kind of very innocent types of cultural figures, or at least allegedly innocent cultural figures that I think we were really presented upon us.
Who epitomizes the cultural icon?
It's got to be Britney Spears,
icon of
right?
Gen X.
If you want to, for Gen Y, for millennials, I would say it's Britney Spears, right? She starts as this kind of incredibly innocent. That's the tale, the kind of origin tale of this person. She's born in the early era of millennials, turns 18 in 1999, kind of right on that moment, and then there's so many promises made about her future. There's such an optimistic outlook, and then things get really, really complicated, rather dark. And here we are today. I think that is one cultural figure that you could look at, that I think you ask any millennial, particularly millennial women, who sort of represented kind of a moment, I think she comes to the fore.
I wonder why that's why you're the unluckiest generation, because you've got Britney Spears as an entire I mean, when the history of the early 21st century gets written, the full history, Charlie, at the end of this century, I wonder whether the millennials will just be forgotten.
Maybe it's Taylor
You'll
Swift.
all be dead.
Right?
So,
you know what?
I mean, what did you do? What did you achieve? It doesn't sound as if you did much except whine about 9/11.
Okay, so look. I want to own all of this, but also look.
You are owning it. You wrote the book on it, so you can't avoid it.
I can't. Stamped on me forever. But look, if you think about who is a millennial now, who's done some pretty big stuff, you got Taylor Swift, right? So I'm going to claim her. Whether you want to.
You can have her. You're welcome to.
Thank you. We got JD Vance, the vice president. Whether
exactly.
Or not you like that. Mark Zuckerberg. I think I know what your response to that is. And Sam Altman. And I think these are people. This is just a sign that I think.
Those are interesting. That's an interesting group. Altman, Zuckerberg,
JD Vance, Taylor
JD
Swift.
Vance. What do they all have in common? And Taylor Swift.
Renegades. Billionaires. I think that you could talk about.
Well, they're successful, but you can always find people who are successful in every generation. But what makes them all millennials?
I think one of the characteristics that you could take is they're people who harnessed the attention economy, right? They either formed it, they literally own the platform for it. They are fashioning a new version of it, of a way to interact with it, whether or not you like that, or they know how to ride the attention economy. And I think that's something that's been so millennial, right? Staying on social, keeping on top. It's exhausting, but I think that's something that, has led to success for these uber successful millennials.
So Sometimes people call you, and of course, Jean Twenge is the psychologist. She always comes up in these sorts of conversations. She's the psychologist of the generation. She calls you Generation Me. Is that fair? Were you a particularly narcissistic generation, or are you a particularly? You sound from the way you're presenting it as if all you wanted, your generation wants to be on social media, and you want others to hear about what you're up to, what you're wearing, what you're not wearing, what you're saying, what you're not saying.
I think that was the concern. And I think a big concern was actually about our childhoods and how our parents had really pushed this idea of self-esteem. Do you remember the self-esteem movement? It was kind of pushed in the 80s and 90s. It was really big in California, but across the
I
United
discouraged
States.
it with my kids, which is why they don't talk to me.
Okay, well, I think that there was a concern that schools, that task forces at the state level, that a lot of cultural figures had pushed this idea that you just needed to feel good about yourself, emphasis on the word self, right? And I think that has kind of led to an association with millennials as being very kind of navel-gazing, as spending too much time on social media. But I think that there's just this unfortunate collide that came. And I think I really like this examination by Satya Doyle Bjork. She wrote this book called Quarter Life. And I think she makes a really good point. And she basically says we need to re-examine those years between, say, the years of kind of 18 and like 25, 30, because that's a point, generations are getting longer. On the whole, people are living longer. And I think sometimes we'll criticize people in whatever generation they are for not reaching certain milestones. But I think that to think that someone turns 18 and snap, they've got everything figured out, I think that's an old notion. And I wanted to challenge that a little bit in this book and explore that notion. And I think the point that Bjork makes is that, there's this real tension in those early years of adulthood, right? Where you're kind of either searching for stability or you're searching for meaning. And that tension is messy. And so you've got, for the first time, this kind of, not for the first time, for as usually happens, this tension in that period of life. But then on top of that, you got social media, and you have this kind of surveillance of millennials for the first time, of a generation going through that, really for the first time in history. And I think that's why the story about us has been pretty bad. And that's why I kind of wanted to defend us, right? That's why I wanted to kind of reassess.
Yeah, and it is a defense. I mean, the subtitle of the book is In Defense of a Generation. What's been the response, Charlie? I mean, you've obviously got 5 main characters in the book who you work carefully with. But what's been the response of, quote unquote, your generation to this? Do most of your Gen X, most of your millennials feel that you need to be defended? Are you all a bit insecure?
I think that there's been some people who have said they feel seen. I think that I go into some, funny moments, embarrassing moments, awkward moments that I think we went through in that period of quarter life. I really focus in on that period between kind of the years of 18 to 30 when you think you know what you're doing, but you actually don't. And I was really thankful that a lot of the subjects that I talked to in this book were really open and honest with me about this. And they wanted people to hear about their stories through work, through their love lives, through their...
Although, again, sorry to keep on jumping in here. As a boomer, I'm always interrupting everyone. Isn't that true of all generations? No one in their 20s. Everyone screws up their 20s.
Yes, everyone does. That's the point.
There's nothing generationally unique about that.
No. And that's the point I'm making with this book. It's like we all go through these life stages. It's just that like the millennial one was particularly easy to look at because a lot of it was broadcast on social media. But thinking about the response to this book, and this is something that I was really touched by. There was something on Goodreads, and some people read the reviews of their books, some people don't. I do. I don't know if that's torture. I don't know if that's millennial navel gazing. But someone literally said this book made her feel less alone. And I think that's probably the best thing that anyone could have said about this book because, we hear a lot about a loneliness epidemic. There's a statistic I cite in this book that says, I think 1 in 3 millennials has said they have 0 best friends. Like it's not a nice time out there, right? And I think that there is this idea.
Why is that? I mean, you hear that as well, and it always sounds so...
It's dire. It's really not good.
It sounds like even that phrase, no best friends, it sounds like you're all still teenagers. You're all still thinking in terms of having best friends.
But look,
would it be fair to say that this is a generation that simply hasn't grown up?
I don't believe that. I think that we have. And I actually think the loneliness epidemic, we could look on statistics, outside this generation. We could look at, a much broader swath of the US or a lot of other countries where there's a lot of, I think, digital use. everyone's lonely, right? I think there was a great article in the Atlantic probably about a year ago about how like Americans just need to go to more parties. They just kind of
I
need
saw
to
that
have
one.
these kind of social engagements that are fun and that are lighthearted. And I think we're in this phase where we're kind of navigating, not just millennials, but an entire and it's just really stuck in that generational framework. An entire society is kind of navigating, okay, so everything could be a Zoom meeting. Should it be or should it not be? Okay, I plan everything out. I used to plan everything out. Should I or should I not? I think some of these more spontaneous engagements can be really helpful. But thinking about that reaction, right? That really just hit home because people are lonely, whether they're millennials or not. And I think something as simple as reading a book and hearing about other people's stories, if that can make you feel better, I'm happy about that. But another takeaway that I really want to tell people from working on this project, talk to strangers, like talk to people outside your kind of bubble. I think it's really easy. We all hear that we're in bubbles, but we don't always get the opportunity to speak with someone who has a totally different world, has a totally different kind of outlook on life, or a set of opportunities. And like, I'm going to own that I'm a privileged person, right? I'm university educated. I work at a great company. I've been given the opportunity to write a book. And some of the people in this book don't have those opportunities and like might not. And I think to speak with them, to have them respect me enough that they would talk to me about what life is like in, say, a small town in Ohio where there's a lot of unemployment, that was an honor. And I hope that other people can do that too, because it taught me a lot. I think I could teach other people.
So how did you choose? You chose 5 people from your generation to write about millennials. How did you? And you've recorded thousands of hours of interviews with them. How did you choose which ones?
I wanted to talk to people who kind of hit on certain facets of the history of the past 25 years. So who had kind of witnessed points in time, who had quote unquote lived through things, but had actually lived through things like 9/11 or the opioid crisis or, navigating America's immigration.
How about the Great Recession?
The recession, yes, exactly. Someone who was working at a martial arts studio and who just kind of felt like that was kind of the best that he could do. So people who kind of witnessed more directly some of these big strands. And I'm a personal finance reporter. And so what I do at work is I often will write a story. Maybe it's like 800, 1,000 words. And those are, not easy to put together. But you call up people and you talk for maybe 20, 30 minutes. And then you write the story, you move on with your life. That's usually it. What I kind of wanted to do here was say like, okay, so we're going to talk about you being a stay-at-home father. But I want to go way back. Like, I want to go back to your childhood. What were you thinking back then? What did you want to be? What are you now? How did you get to the point that you're at?
So you had to be a little bit of a therapist, did you?
Well, I needed to keep a boundary, right? And I think sometimes there would be moments where some of my sources would say, oh, this is better than therapy. And I'd be like, you know what? This is not therapy. Like, we're talking and I'm listening and I'm actively listening to you. And this is so fun, but this is not therapy, right?
Yeah, well, you didn't have a couch, did you?
No couch, just a phone. And I didn't do video. So it was just like me on the phone with these people talking. And it takes, I think it takes a lot of people in whatever generation they are back. I'm sure Gen Z does this in some way, shape, or form. But
yeah, I want to come to Gen Z in a second. But is there again, I can't make generalizations because of the 5 people that you focus on in your book. But there does seem to be, and you've talked a lot about social media, there does seem to be a deeply confessional quality to this generation. May not be formally religious. You may not all join the Roman Catholic Church, although you've mentioned J.D. Vance, who's a born-again Catholic. But is this a confessional generation that gives that somehow naturally reveals itself? You've talked about surveillance capitalism and social media. But what is it about this generation that makes it so seemingly confessional?
There literally is a type of filming on reality television, which of course also rose over the course of a generation, called the confessional, where you see the scenes playing out, you see the people arguing or fighting or what have you in whatever reality show they're on, and then boom, they cut to the confessional where it's the person talking about what they actually think, what they actually thought in that moment. And I think, earlier on in this conversation, we were talking about how kind of world events can shape media. I think also media is really important, right? And what we see on the media, even something kind of as simple as a framing device, a filming device for a reality show, that can influence how we talk. And I think it can make people think, all right, like, when's my confessional? Like, and so in some ways this was that, right? It was like long confessional chats with these people. And I think there's no doubt that that element of reality television, which has been such a big part of the millennial story, that's had an influence on the way that we communicate with each other.
Did you ever fall asleep? Did you ever find it really boring when everyone was telling you their hour-long confession?
Because people, when people know that they've got a story to talk about, like, they're going to think about stories. And I actually think, I can be on my high horses. I'm a journalist. I'm going to ask such great questions. It was actually the stories people brought to those confessional conversations that were always better. And it's because people talked about them. That it was kind of the narrative. I think.
So, is there a story that you couldn't publish that's so bad, so shameful, so disruptive, so disgusting that we won't mention names, but in this confessional?
I'm going to say it was a question of relevance. I'm gonna punt.
What do you mean?
It was a question of relevance. Like, people bring up stuff that's really serious, that really affects their lives, and it's just, that's kind of not really relevant to what we're talking about. So I think it's a judgment call that an author has to make, right? Like, what is relevant to the story, what is not? Yeah, that's an interesting tale. That was really dramatic. That was really horrible, or that was really great. But how does that intertwine with kind of the scope of the history that we're looking at? I think question mark.
Finally, Charlie, your generation, it seems to have grown up, although, of course, some people might argue that that's the defining quality of millennials is they haven't, but maybe they have. What advice would you give Gen Zers? I mean, not all Gen Zers, of course, are Tyler Robinson or Luigi Mangione, but it seems to be a generation particularly marked by misogyny and hatred and violence. What lessons have you've written this defense of millennials? What advice should or can your generation pass down to younger Americans, particularly the Gen Zers, who seem to be having a moment, not the best moment at the moment?
Put down the phone. Just put it down. You can be on it. That's fine. But just like, put it down. Go for a walk. Talk to a stranger. I think this was a point. I asked a lot of the people in my book about this, like, what they would do. And some of them are starting to have kids and they want to pass on lessons too. And it's literally this idea of being a bridge, like remembering a childhood before. Because, right, we were the millennials, if you think about the timing, we really were the last generation. I think this is why some of the markers kind of get set where they are. We're the last generation that remembers a kind of pre-internet childhood. And there were problems with that, but there were also significant benefits from that. And a lot of these millennial parents talk about how they want to teach their children about some of the benefits of that, of kind of not being constantly connected. And I think actually, and I would want to look on the data to see what I could actually, whether or not this is actually representative, but you do see a pretty ardent anti-screen time element in a lot of millennial parenting. And I think it's because of this concern that we're seeing with Gen Z. So I think put down the phone, go talk to people. There is, like, we are social creatures by nature. I can say it as someone who spoke with a lot of millennials. I can say it as someone who has, the honor of talking to people, of strangers every day. You get something from breaking out and not talking to strangers on the internet, but just like on the phone, in face to face. There's something to, or just being pushed a little bit, right? Like, you've been pushing me in this conversation and it's been great. Like, it's been uncomfortable, but it's been great.
Yeah, it seems like everything ultimately in the book and in your thinking about the millennials comes down to tech, Charlie. That's what defines the generation. That's the advice you would give Gen Zers: escape from tech, screen time, social media. Is there anything except tech really to your generation?
I think just follow the data, right? I think the data changes.
Well, even data is a bit of a techie word.
This is that. I mean, maybe we're all just kind of cyborgs living online, and the real world is just a kind of extension of that now. But narratives stick. And I think the data can shift. And I think sometimes if you're stuck in an old narrative, you cannot face problems that you actually are facing, or you can use excuses, or you can fall on old tropes that actually aren't helpful. So keep up with the data, challenge yourself, and put down the phone.
Well, I've changed my mind on millennials being the unluckiest generation. I think they're very lucky. They have a great biographer, Charlie Wales, who is a Gen Xer, or is that, I get them all confused. He is a millennial himself, and he speaks in a very passionate and articulate way about you all. So you all need to thank him. Go out and buy his new book. It's called What Happened to Millennials? No question mark, just something that happened to them. In Defense of a Generation. Congratulations, Charlie. The book is out today. So it's a good reason to put down your screens, go out, go to a real bookstore, buy the book, and go and sit in the park and read it. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Thank you for having me.